What would you do when your family fabricates and slanders terrible things about you to the entire town and acts as if you are dead to them? Tonight, I found the story of Lillian. She was a useless child, a disgrace to the family. After 8 years, her return and the truths about the prestigious family are revealed. The moment everything explodes is something no one could have imagined. Stay with me to the end of the story to see the horrifying truth and how Lillian retaliates for the years of humiliation she endured.
My mom stood up the moment I walked into the conference room and calmly announced that I was no longer her daughter. She did not raise her voice. She did not even look angry. She said it the way someone might say the coffee was too cold. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Not my dad, not my sister Vanessa, not the three cousins sitting along the wall. Even the lawyer stopped flipping through his papers. I stood there holding the door handle, wondering if I had misheard her. Then my dad leaned back in his chair and nodded slowly, like this was a perfectly reasonable thing to say. She made that choice 8 years ago, he said. She walked away from this family. She does not belong to the Mercers anymore. The room settled around those words like dust after a collapse. If you have ever had someone erase you with a single sentence, then you already know the feeling. If not, stay with me for a moment. Because the strange part of the story is not what they said that morning. The strange part is what happened next. I closed the door behind me and walked into the room. Nobody offered a chair. That did not bother me. I pulled one out myself and sat across from the long oak table where my parents and sister were waiting. The office belonged to Samuel Carter, the only estate attorney in Willowbrook who people trusted when things involved land, money, and family grudges that stretched back decades. The conference room looked exactly like every other small-town lawyer's office in Ohio. Tan walls. A framed picture of the courthouse square. A long wooden table polished so many times the surface reflected the fluorescent lights above it. The clock on the wall said 10:23 in the morning. Mr. Carter cleared his throat gently. We can proceed if everyone is ready. My mom folded her arms. We have already said what needs to be said. My dad did not look at me again. He was studying a document on the table as if the grain of the wood was more interesting than the daughter sitting across from him. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, lips pressed into a small smile that looked almost satisfied. I had not seen her in 8 years. She looked almost the same. Same blonde hair pulled into a careful bun. Same nurse scrubs under her jacket because she had come directly from the hospital shift. People in Willowbrook loved Vanessa. She worked in the emergency department. She volunteered at church drives. She always remembered birthdays. The perfect daughter. The dependable one. At least that was the version of her everyone repeated. Mr. Carter opened the folder in front of him. We are here to review the last will and testament of your grandmother. He glanced at me briefly before continuing. Your grandmother asked that the entire family be present when the document was read. My mom let out a small breath of annoyance. She was confused near the end. Mr. Carter shook his head calmly. I met with her personally 3 times last year. My dad tapped the table once with his finger. Just read it. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and began. The primary residential property located on Maple Ridge Road shall be transferred to my granddaughter. He paused. Vanessa leaned forward slightly, clearly expecting her name. Instead, the lawyer finished the sentence. My granddaughter Lillian Mercer. The silence that followed was not loud, it was heavy. My mom blinked like someone had just changed the lighting in the room. Vanessa laughed once, short and sharp. That has to be a mistake. My dad finally looked at me again, not with surprise, with irritation. Mr. Carter calmly turned a page. There is no mistake. He slid a copy of the document across the table. Your grandmother left the residence and surrounding estate to Lillian Mercer. My mom's chair scraped against the floor as she stood up again. That girl abandoned her grandmother. She pointed directly at me. She disappeared 8 years ago. Vanessa nodded quickly. She did not visit once. I almost said something, but I had learned something valuable during the 8 years I spent away from Willowbrook. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is let people keep talking. Mr. Carter continued reading. The residential property has an estimated current value of approximately $2.5 million. Vanessa's eyes widened. $2.5 million. She leaned forward again. That house is not worth that much. The lawyer remained calm. The appraisal was completed 3 months ago. My dad pushed his chair back slightly. It does not matter what the appraisal says. That house belongs to this family. Mr. Carter looked at him carefully. According to the will, it belongs to your daughter. The tension in the room tightened another notch. But the lawyer was not finished. There are also 2 parcels of land located directly behind the residence. My mom waved her hand dismissively. Those empty lots. The lawyer read from the document again. Those parcels are included in the inheritance. Vanessa frowned. Nobody wants those. Mr. Carter looked up. Those parcels are currently part of a pending city development proposal. He paused long enough for the words to settle. Their estimated value is over $3 billion. This time, nobody laughed. Even the air in the room felt different. My dad stared at the lawyer like he had misheard him. $3 billion. The lawyer nodded once. Based on current projections. My mom looked from the lawyer to me and back again. That is impossible. Vanessa leaned forward so quickly her chair almost tipped. That land belongs to this family. The lawyer shook his head slowly. According to the will, it belongs to Lillian Mercer. My dad stood up. We will challenge this. The words came out hard and flat. That girl left this family 8 years ago. He pointed at me. She does not get to walk back in and take everything. Mr. Carter did not react. You are free to contest the will. Vanessa turned toward me. You left Grandma alone. Her voice carried the kind of anger that sounds convincing when people believe the story behind it. You walked away and never looked back. I met her eyes. That was the second lie spoken in that room. My mom crossed her arms again. She took money from us when she left. My dad nodded. Stole it. Vanessa added quickly. And ran off with that useless boyfriend. The words hung there. The old accusations. The same ones they had been repeating for years. The room felt smaller suddenly. But I did not defend myself. Not yet. Mr. Carter closed the folder. The reading of the will is complete. My dad was already pulling on his jacket. We will see you in court. My mom followed him toward the door. Vanessa lingered for a moment. She leaned closer to me as she passed. You think you won something today. She smiled faintly. You have no idea what you just started. Then she walked out. The room finally emptied. Mr. Carter gathered the documents quietly. I remained seated for another minute, watching the dust floating in the sunlight coming through the blinds. Well, he said gently, that went about the way your grandmother expected. I looked at him. She knew they would react like that. He nodded. Your grandmother understood your family very well. I stood up slowly. So the fight begins. Mr. Carter gave a small smile. I believe it already has. I thanked him and walked out of the building. The air outside Willowbrook felt cooler than I expected. I got into my car and drove across town without turning on the radio. 10 minutes later, I turned onto Maple Ridge Road. The house appeared at the end of the street exactly where it had always been. White siding, wide porch. The maple trees my grandfather planted decades earlier still lining the driveway. My parents' car sat in front. They had been living there for years. Everyone in town believed the house belonged to them, but my grandfather had left it to Grandma, and Grandma had just left it to me. I slowed the car as I passed the driveway. Through the front window, I could see my mom moving around the living room. My dad stood near the fireplace speaking on the phone, probably already calling a lawyer. I did not stop the car. I kept driving down the road. 8 years ago, they told everyone I was a useless daughter, a thief, a girl who ran away with a worthless man and stole money from her own family on the way out. For 8 years, that story followed me everywhere in this town. People believed it, because it was easier than asking questions. I turned at the end of the road and looked once more in the mirror. The house was getting smaller behind me, but something else was growing, a quiet certainty. The legal battle had not started yet, but it was coming. And this time I was not the one walking away. I drove past the town square and realized something strange. Nothing in Willowbrook had changed. The same brick courthouse stood in the center of town. The same diner on the corner where retirees drank coffee every morning. The same hardware store that still sold nails by the pound like it was 1985. Small towns have long memories, but they also have very simple versions of the truth. In Willowbrook, everyone already knew my story, at least the version my parents told. 8 years earlier, my name had started appearing in quiet conversations across town. Not dramatic gossip, not loud scandals, something worse. Sympathetic disappointment. People would shake their heads and say things like that Mercer girl went down the wrong path, or that poor family, raising a daughter like that must be heartbreaking. The story spread quickly because my parents were careful about how they told it. Dad never said I was evil. That would have sounded too extreme. Instead, he described me as weak, useless, lost. And weakness makes people uncomfortable in a small town that prides itself on discipline. It started in the fall of 2016. That was the year everything cracked open. At that time, Mercer Family Dentistry had already been operating in Willowbrook for almost 40 years. My grandfather built the practice from nothing. Just a small office with 2 chairs and a waiting room that smelled like mint antiseptic and cheap carpet cleaner. By the time I was a child, the clinic had become something bigger. 3 examination rooms, 2 hygienists, patients from 3 neighboring counties. Dad took it over after grandfather retired. Everyone in town expected the same thing from me. Mercer daughters became dentists. It was not written anywhere. But in Willowbrook, expectations are stronger than contracts. I remember the exact evening the conversation happened, October 7th, 7:35 in the evening. We were sitting in the dining room at the house on Maple Ridge. Mom had made pot roast. Vanessa had just started her nursing job at the hospital. Dad was in a good mood because the clinic had signed a new insurance contract. He set his fork down and looked at me across the table. Dental school applications open next month. The sentence landed quietly, but it was not really a suggestion. I had already been accepted into a volunteer program with a medical charity based in Cleveland. They provided basic care in low-income communities, mobile clinics, free checkups, dental outreach for people who could not afford treatment. I had spent months preparing the application. I told Dad about it. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he wiped his mouth with a napkin. "You are not doing that." I blinked. "What?" "You are applying to Ohio State Dental School next fall." His voice was calm, the way a man explains something obvious. I shook my head. "I do not want to be a dentist." Silence fell across the table. Vanessa looked down at her plate. Mom watched Dad carefully. Dad leaned back in his chair. "Every Mercer in this family has built something here. I understand that." He cut me off. "No, you do not." He pointed toward the window where the lights of the town glowed faintly beyond the trees. "That clinic feeds this family. People respect our name because of it." I tried to stay calm. Helping people through medical outreach is not disrespecting the family. Dad laughed once, a short, humorless sound. "Driving around in vans, treating strangers for free. That is not a career. That is charity work for people who cannot build anything real." The words hit harder than he probably realized. Mom spoke softly then. "Your dad just wants stability for you." Vanessa finally looked up. "Dental school is not that bad." She said it the way someone recommends a restaurant. I felt something tightening inside my chest. It was not anger yet, just the slow realization that nobody in that room had ever actually asked what I wanted. Dad leaned forward again. "You have the grades, the opportunity, the name. All you have to do is continue the work." I pushed my chair back slightly. "I do not want that life." The room went very still. Dad stared at me like I had just said something absurd. "You are 23 years old." "Exactly." "Which means I get to decide my own future." That was the moment everything changed. Dad's expression hardened. "No, you do not." Mom shifted in her chair. "Maybe we should talk about this later." But Dad was already standing. "If you walk away from this family business, do not expect to come back." His voice had grown sharper. "You think the world is waiting for you out there. You will discover very quickly it is not." I stood up too. "I am not asking you to support it. I am just telling you what I am doing." Vanessa whispered something to Mom. Dad laughed again. "So that is it. You are throwing away everything your grandfather built." I shook my head. "I am choosing something different." Dad looked at me for a long moment. Then he said something that stayed with me for years. "If you walk out that door, do not come back here pretending you are still part of this family." The words settled heavily in the room. Mom stared at the table. Vanessa avoided my eyes. I waited. Part of me expected someone to speak up, to soften the moment. No one did. So I walked upstairs and packed a small suitcase. Not dramatically, just a few clothes, my laptop, some notebooks. When I came back downstairs, Dad was sitting in the living room watching the evening news. He did not look at me. Mom stood in the hallway. "You are making a mistake." "Maybe." She folded her arms. "You will regret this." I picked up my bag. "Maybe." When I reached the door, Dad finally spoke. "If you leave, do not take a single dollar from this house." The accusation was already there, hanging quietly beneath the surface, like he expected me to prove him right. I left without touching anything. The front door closed behind me with a soft click. That was the last time I lived in that house. But the story did not end there. Because within days, the town had heard a very different version of what happened. Dad told patients at the clinic that his daughter had run off with a worthless boyfriend. Mom told neighbors I had stolen money from the family before leaving. Vanessa mentioned missing cash from drawers that nobody had ever counted carefully, little pieces of a story, repeated enough times that they became accepted truth. Soon, people in town were shaking their heads when my name came up. Such a waste, running off like that, breaking her parents' hearts. The Mercer girl who stole money and followed a useless man out of town. It was a clean story, simple, and in Willowbrook, simple stories travel fast. The only person who never believed it was Grandma. She called me 2 nights after I left. Her voice sounded tired but steady. "I heard what they are saying. I did not steal anything. I know." Her certainty made my chest tighten. "Then come visit when you can." So I did, not often, but enough. And every time I returned to Willowbrook over those 8 years, I noticed the same thing. People remembered the story. They just did not know the truth behind it. I slowed the car as I passed the edge of town. The sign for Mercer Family Dentistry stood beside the road. White letters, blue background. The building looked exactly the same as it had the day I left. 3 dental chairs inside. A waiting room full of patients who trusted the Mercer name. I parked across the street and stared at the sign for a long moment. 8 years ago, Dad told me if I walked away, I did not belong to this family anymore. Now the same family was preparing to fight me in court over land worth billions. Funny how quickly belonging becomes negotiable when money appears. I started the engine again. And for the first time that morning, I wondered how far my parents were willing to go to keep the story they had built alive. I drove back toward Maple Ridge Road slowly, not because I was unsure where I was going. The route to that house had been carved into my memory long before I learned how to drive. The road curved past the old water tower and then dipped slightly before the houses appeared again between the trees. When I turned onto Maple Ridge, the air felt quieter somehow. It always had. The house came into view at the end of the road, exactly the way it had when my grandfather was alive. Tall white columns, wide porch, a roof that had been replaced 3 times over the decades, but still looked original from the street. My grandfather built that house with his own hands in 1978. He used to say that a house built slowly lasts longer. I parked along the curb and sat in the car for a moment. The windows were dark. My parents must have gone back to the clinic. The place looked peaceful. Too peaceful for a house that had just ignited a legal war worth billions. I stepped out of the car and walked up the driveway. The gravel crunched under my shoes the same way it always had. For a moment, I almost expected the front door to open and Grandma to step out holding a dish towel the way she used to when I arrived for dinner. But the porch stayed empty. I reached the door and paused. The brass handle felt cold. Then the door opened before I could knock. A woman stood there with gray hair pulled back and kind eyes that looked tired but steady. Grace Holloway. She had been the nurse who helped take care of Grandma during the last years. I had only met her once before. But she recognized me immediately. "You must be Lillian." I nodded. "Yes." Her expression softened. "Your grandmother talked about you every week." That sentence alone almost knocked the air out of my lungs. Grace stepped aside and let me in. The house smelled faintly like lavender cleaner and old wood. The living room looked almost the same. Grandma's chair was still by the window. A folded blanket rested over the arm. Grace walked toward the kitchen and motioned for me to sit. "Coffee." I nodded again. "Thank you." She poured 2 cups and placed one in front of me. For a few seconds, we sat quietly. Then Grace sighed. I heard about the will reading this morning. News travels quickly in Willowbrook. I gave a small smile. It always has. She studied my face carefully. Your parents were not happy. That was an understatement. Grace shook her head slowly. Your grandmother expected that. I leaned forward slightly. Did they visit her much? Grace hesitated before answering. No, just that one word. Then she added more quietly, not in the last 2 years. The sentence hung there between us, 2 years. That was a long time for an 84-year-old woman to wait for her family. I stared down at the coffee for a moment. I used to call her every week. Grace nodded, she told me. Every Sunday evening, 7 o'clock. The routine had started accidentally. The first year after I left Willowbrook was messy. I was living in Cleveland then, working with the outreach medical program I had chosen instead of dental school. The work was exhausting. Mobile clinics in neighborhoods that barely had grocery stores. Children with untreated infections. Adults who had not seen a dentist in 10 years. But every Sunday evening at 7, I stepped outside the clinic building and called Grandma. Sometimes we talked about serious things. Sometimes we talked about nothing at all. The weather, her garden, the ridiculous television shows she liked to watch. She always asked the same question near the end of the call. Are you eating enough? I always said yes, even when the answer was no. Grace smiled faintly. She looked forward to those calls. I swallowed and nodded. Those calls were the only connection I had left to Willowbrook. Grace leaned back in her chair. She would sit right there in the living room waiting for the phone to ring. She pointed toward the old armchair by the window. Every Sunday. I pictured it clearly. Grandma sitting there with the cordless phone resting on the small table beside her, looking at the clock, waiting. Grace continued. Sometimes she talked about you for an hour after the call ended. I felt something tighten in my chest. What did she say? Grace shrugged gently. That you were stubborn, that you were trying to help people, that you refused to live a life someone else chose for you. She smiled slightly. She admired that. I let out a slow breath. Dad had described my decision very differently. According to him, I had run away, chasing some useless boyfriend and stealing money on my way out. Grace watched me carefully. Your parents told a very different story around town. I nodded. I know. Grace folded her hands. Your grandmother knew that story was not true. She always defended you. That did not surprise me. Grandma had always been good at separating truth from performance. Grace continued speaking. After the first year, your grandmother started having trouble keeping up with the property taxes. The house was expensive to maintain. I nodded again. I remember that conversation. It happened during one of our Sunday calls. Grandma tried to pretend everything was fine, but I could hear the hesitation in her voice. So I started sending money, not a dramatic amount, just enough to cover the property taxes and Grace's salary. Every month beginning in 2017. Grace confirmed it quietly. Your payments kept this house running. I stared at the table. Did my parents know? Grace hesitated again. They knew someone was paying the bills, but your grandmother never told them it was you. I almost laughed. That sounded exactly like Grandma. She believed in privacy the same way other people believe in religion. Grace stood and walked to the window. Your parents visited a few times during the first year, mostly holidays. Then it became less frequent. Eventually it stopped. 2 years without a visit. 2 years while the town believed I had abandoned her. Grace turned back toward me. You were the only person who called consistently. The only one who asked about her health. The only one who sent money when things became difficult. I leaned back slowly, and yet my parents were telling the court I had abandoned her. Grace nodded. That seems to be the story. The quiet inside the house felt heavier now, the kind of silence that forms when the truth becomes obvious. I stood up and walked into the living room. Grandma's chair was still there. The small wooden table beside it still held the same ceramic lamp she had owned for 20 years. Grace spoke behind me. Your grandmother believed the truth would come out eventually. I turned toward her. Did she say that? Many times. I looked around the room again. The house was peaceful. But the story my parents were preparing to tell the court painted a very different picture. A daughter who abandoned her grandmother. A granddaughter who only appeared when money was involved. The reality sitting inside this house was the opposite, and suddenly I understood something clearly. The story my family had been repeating for 8 years was about to collide with the facts. And facts, unlike gossip, leave evidence behind. 3 days after the will reading, the first official envelope arrived. It was waiting on the small table in the hallway when I returned to the house on Maple Ridge that afternoon. Grace had already gone home for the day, leaving the place quiet again except for the ticking of the old wall clock. The envelope had my name printed neatly across the front, Lillian Mercer. The return address belonged to a law firm in Columbus. I did not need to open it to know what it was. Still, I carried it into the kitchen and sat at the table before sliding my finger under the seal. Inside was exactly what I expected. My parents and Vanessa had filed a formal petition to challenge the will. The language was careful and cold. They claimed I had abandoned my grandmother. They claimed I had severed ties with the family and therefore had no moral claim to her estate. They also argued that my grandmother had been confused and vulnerable during the final months of her life. In other words, they were suggesting the will was invalid. I read the document twice. The accusations were not surprising. What surprised me was how polished the story had become. 8 years earlier, it had been whispers around town. Now it was typed on official legal paper. Abandonment, neglect, manipulation. My phone rang before I finished the last page. Samuel Carter. I answered. I assume the paperwork arrived. Yes, his voice was calm. They filed faster than I expected. I leaned back in the chair. I suppose they believe this will be easy. Mr. Carter let out a quiet breath. Most families believe that at the beginning, he asked if I could come to his office the following morning. There are a few details we should discuss in person. The next day, the courthouse clock read 9:10 in the morning when I walked into his building again. Mr. Carter was already seated in the conference room with several documents spread across the table. He motioned for me to sit. Your parents are claiming you abandoned your grandmother. I nodded. That is their favorite version of events. He folded his hands. We will address that claim easily enough. Grace Holloway's testimony alone contradicts it. I felt a small sense of relief hearing her name. Grace had been the quiet witness to the truth. But Mr. Carter was not finished. There is another matter we need to discuss. He slid a thick folder toward me. Inside were copies of property records dating back decades. I recognized the address immediately. The house on Maple Ridge. Your grandfather purchased the property in 1978. Yes. He built the house himself. Mr. Carter nodded. After his death, the property was transferred entirely to your grandmother. I leaned forward slightly. That part I knew. What I did not know was what happened after. Mr. Carter tapped one of the documents. Approximately 12 years ago, your father moved into the residence with your mother. I almost smiled. Moved in. That was a polite way of describing it. Dad had insisted the house was too large for Grandma to manage alone. He said it would be safer if they lived there. Family takes care of family. The same phrase he always used. Mr. Carter continued. However, the property itself was never transferred. Legally speaking, your grandmother remained the sole owner until her death. I stared at the paperwork. Which means the residence became part of her estate, and the estate was left to me. Mr. Carter nodded. Correct. For a moment, the room felt very quiet. My parents had been living in that house for more than a decade. Everyone in town believed it belonged to them, but legally, it never had. I leaned back in the chair. Did my dad know that? Mr. Carter gave a careful answer. He would have signed the occupancy agreement when he moved in. So yes, he would have known the house remained in your grandmother's name. The picture was becoming clearer. Dad had not stolen the house. Not exactly. He had simply positioned himself inside it. Then, over time, the town began assuming it was his. Assumptions are powerful things in small communities. Mr. Carter continued. When your grandmother updated her will last year, she specifically referenced the residence as part of the inheritance. He pointed to a line in the document. The Maple Ridge property and all attached structures shall pass to my granddaughter, Lillian Mercer. I read the sentence slowly, which means my parents are currently living in a house that now belongs to me, legally speaking. Yes. The realization felt strange. Not triumphant, just complicated. That house held most of my childhood memories. Christmas mornings, Grandma baking pies in the kitchen, my grandfather fixing the porch railing every spring. Now it had become a legal asset. Mr. Carter opened another folder. There is more. I raised an eyebrow. More. Your parents' legal petition argues that you had no involvement in your grandmother's care. We already know that is false. But they are also attempting to claim that the property management over the last decade was handled entirely by them, meaning they are suggesting the house is effectively theirs. He paused, which is difficult to argue when the financial records show otherwise. I frowned. What records? Mr. Carter slid a printed bank statement toward me. Your payments. Every month since 2017, property tax, maintenance, Grace Holloway's salary. The totals were listed clearly, year after year. I recognized every number. You kept those records. Your grandmother kept them. She wanted everything documented. I shook my head slowly. Grandma always planned 3 steps ahead. Mr. Carter smiled faintly. She certainly did. He leaned back in his chair. Your parents appear to believe they are contesting a simple inheritance dispute. I studied the papers again. But it is not simple. No. Because the moment they challenge the will, the court will review the full property history, which includes the fact that your father has been living in a residence he never legally owned. The weight of that statement settled slowly. My dad had built his reputation in Willowbrook on responsibility, discipline, family values. Yet legally he had been occupying a property that belonged to his mother for more than a decade, and now that property belonged to me. Mr. Carter closed the folder. Your parents may believe they are attacking your credibility, but this case opens several questions about their own actions. I looked at him. How complicated is this going to become? He gave a small, thoughtful smile. Much more complicated than your family currently realizes. And something in his tone told me that the legal fight ahead was about to expose far more than anyone in Willowbrook expected. The first court hearing took place 2 weeks later. The courthouse had not changed much since I was a child. Same limestone steps, same echo in the hallway when people walked across the tile floors. The air inside still carried that faint smell of old paper and cleaning solution. I arrived early. That was another habit I had picked up during the years away from Willowbrook. When something mattered, you arrived early enough to observe the room before anyone else began performing. By 9:20 in the morning, the courtroom was already filling with familiar faces. In a small town, a legal dispute involving the Mercer family counted as public entertainment. Several people from the clinic were there, a few neighbors from Maple Ridge. Even the owner of the diner near the courthouse sat quietly in the back row, pretending not to watch too closely. My parents sat at the front with their attorney. Mom wore the same pearl necklace she reserved for church events and community dinners. Dad looked exactly the way he always did at the clinic. Crisp white shirt, serious expression, the picture of discipline. Vanessa sat beside them. She looked polished and calm. Her nursing uniform had been replaced with a dark blue blazer. Her hair was pulled into the neat bun people in town had come to associate with professionalism. If someone walked into that room without context, they would see a devoted nurse defending her family. That was the image my parents had carefully built over the years. Vanessa noticed me when I entered. Her eyes narrowed slightly, then she turned away like I was an unpleasant distraction. I took a seat beside Mr. Carter at the opposite table. He leaned toward me and spoke quietly. The first hearing is mostly procedural. I nodded. I know. But he added something else. Still, people reveal more than they intend when they start talking. The judge entered at 9:30 in the morning. A woman in her late 50s with silver hair and a steady voice that carried easily across the room. Everyone stood briefly before sitting again. The opening statements were predictable. My parents' attorney stood and began describing a sad family situation. He spoke about a granddaughter who had abandoned her elderly grandmother, a devoted daughter who remained behind to care for the family. Vanessa. The words flowed smoothly. Years of responsibility. Long hours balancing hospital work with caring for her grandmother. Financial oversight to ensure bills were paid. I glanced at Vanessa while he spoke. She kept her hands folded neatly in her lap. If anyone in that room had doubts about the story, they did not show it. When the attorney finished, Mr. Carter stood. He spoke less dramatically. Just a calm summary of the facts. Your Honor, the estate records will demonstrate that the decedent maintained full ownership of her property and finances until the time of her passing. The evidence will also show that the individual claiming financial oversight withdrew substantial funds from those accounts for personal use. He paused, and those records are quite specific. The judge nodded once. Proceed. Vanessa was called to the stand first. She walked up confidently and sat down. The bailiff asked her to swear to tell the truth. She did so without hesitation. My parents' attorney approached her. Miss Mercer, could you describe your relationship with your grandmother during the last years of her life? Vanessa smiled gently. We were very close. She explained how she visited often after hospital shifts, how she helped organize medications, how she handled financial matters because her grandmother found banking confusing. Everything sounded compassionate, responsible. Exactly the image the town already believed. And then the attorney asked the key question. Did you manage your grandmother's financial accounts? Yes. Why? Because she trusted me. Vanessa glanced briefly toward my parents. And because someone needed to make sure the bills were paid. The implication hung there. That someone was not me. The attorney finished his questions and sat down. Mr. Carter stood slowly. Miss Mercer, you testified that you managed your grandmother's finances, yes? Did that include withdrawing money from her bank account? Yes, for household expenses. Mr. Carter nodded. He walked to the evidence table and picked up a folder. The court would like to call our next witness. The bailiff opened the side door and a tall man stepped inside. I recognized him immediately. Peter Langford, branch manager of First Federal Bank. He had worked at the Willowbrook branch for more than 20 years. He took the stand and swore the same oath. Mr. Carter approached him. Mr. Langford, are you familiar with the accounts belonging to the decedent? Yes. Did those accounts experience regular withdrawals over the last several years? Yes. Mr. Carter handed him a document. Could you describe the pattern? Mr. Langford adjusted his glasses and read quietly. Beginning in early 2017, there were regular cash withdrawals, approximately $2,000 per week on average, occasionally higher. Mr. Carter spoke again. And who conducted those withdrawals? Mr. Langford looked toward Vanessa. Miss Vanessa Mercer. A quiet ripple moved through the courtroom. Mr. Carter continued. Were these withdrawals authorized by written power of attorney? No. Vanessa shifted slightly in her chair. Mr. Carter turned toward her. Miss Mercer, could you explain the purpose of these withdrawals? She answered quickly. Household expenses, groceries, utilities, medical supplies. Mr. Carter nodded slowly. Then he handed another sheet to Mr. Langford. Could you read the transfer records from these dates? Mr. Langford read aloud. Electronic transfers totaling $128,000 to an account belonging to Kyle Benton. Vanessa stiffened. The courtroom grew quieter. Mr. Carter asked the obvious question. Who is Kyle Benton? Vanessa's voice sounded tighter now. A friend. Mr. Carter waited. Mr. Langford continued reading. Additional transfers totaling $82,000. Same recipient, Kyle Benton. Mr. Carter turned back toward Vanessa. Could you explain why your grandmother's account sent over $200,000 to this individual? Vanessa's composure began to crack. That was not theft. What was it? She hesitated. A loan. Mr. Carter raised an eyebrow. Did your grandmother authorize this loan? Vanessa looked toward my parents again. I handled the finances. That was not the question. Did your grandmother authorize the loan? Vanessa's voice sharpened. She trusted me to make decisions. Mr. Carter let the silence stretch for a moment. Then he spoke again. Did you inform your grandmother that her funds are being transferred to your boyfriend? Vanessa's face flushed. He was not just my boyfriend. The judge interrupted calmly. Please answer the question. Vanessa's eyes moved around the courtroom. Finally, she muttered, No. Mr. Carter nodded. No further questions. The courtroom remained silent for several seconds. The image Vanessa had carried into that room was beginning to crack. The perfect nurse. The devoted granddaughter. Now the financial records were telling a different story. The judge reviewed the documents slowly. Her expression remained neutral. But when she finally spoke, her voice carried weight. The court notes the possibility of financial misappropriation from the decedent's accounts. She looked toward Vanessa. Further examination will be required. Vanessa stared straight ahead, her hands clenched tightly together. Across the room, my parents looked stunned, and for the first time since the case began, the story they had built for 8 years started to unravel in front of everyone. The courtroom did not explode into drama the way people imagine when they think about legal confrontations. Instead, it became very quiet. The kind of quiet that comes when people realize they may have been listening to the wrong story. Vanessa stepped down from the witness stand looking smaller than she had an hour earlier. Her shoulders were stiff. She avoided looking toward the gallery where several people from town sat watching. Mom reached for her arm when she returned to the table. Dad leaned forward and whispered something sharply to their attorney. I could not hear the words, but I recognized the tone. Damage control. The judge called for a short recess. People stood and stretched. A few quiet conversations started along the benches in the back. Whispers moved quickly in a small courtroom. Mr. Carter remained seated beside me. He was reviewing another folder. This part was expected, he said quietly. I watched my parents across the room. Vanessa kept staring at the floor. Mom held her hand like she was trying to steady her. Dad looked different, not angry, confused, as if the script he had prepared no longer matched the performance unfolding in front of him. When the judge returned 20 minutes later, the hearing resumed. My parents' attorney stood again. Your Honor, while there may be questions about financial management, the primary issue remains the estate itself. He paused for emphasis, particularly the 2 land parcels behind the residence. The shift in topic was obvious. They wanted distance from the bank records. The attorney continued. Those parcels were purchased by the decedent late in life under circumstances that deserve closer examination. He glanced briefly at me. We believe the defendant may have manipulated those transactions. I felt Mr. Carter's hand move slightly as he closed the folder beside him. Dad stood then. The judge allowed him to speak. My mother bought that land because my daughter convinced her it was some kind of investment. His voice carried across the room. That girl has been influencing her grandmother for years. There it was, the new version of the story. I leaned back in my chair. It was almost impressive how quickly the accusations evolved. The judge looked toward Mr. Carter. Your response. Mr. Carter rose calmly. Your Honor, we anticipated this argument. He walked to the evidence table and lifted a thick document binder. This folder contains the full purchase history of the 2 parcels in question. He handed copies to the judge and opposing counsel. The purchase occurred in the spring of 2019. Dad frowned. That cannot be right. But Mr. Carter continued. The financial transaction was completed through a Cleveland development bank. The buyer of record was the decedent, my grandmother. The attorney representing my parents leaned forward. Exactly. He pointed toward me, which proves she manipulated her grandmother. Mr. Carter shook his head gently. The funds used for the purchase came from an account belonging to Lillian Mercer. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Dad laughed under his breath. That is impossible. My daughter did not have that kind of money. Mr. Carter turned slightly toward him. According to the bank records, she did. The judge flipped through the pages slowly. The amount listed on the purchase agreement was $800,000, paid in full. My parents' attorney cleared his throat. This does not explain why the property was placed in the grandmother's name. Mr. Carter looked toward me. Perhaps Lillian should explain. The judge nodded. I stood and walked to the witness stand. The wood felt smooth under my hands as I took the oath. My voice sounded steadier than I expected. Mr. Carter began with a simple question. Miss Mercer, did you purchase the 2 parcels behind the Maple Ridge residence? Yes. In the spring of 2019. Why? I glanced briefly toward the back window, where sunlight spilled across the courtroom floor. Then I answered, because my grandmother had a dream. Dad shifted in his seat. I continued. When I started working in community medical outreach programs, I saw something very clearly. There are thousands of children in this country who grow up without stable homes. Many of them never get proper medical or dental care. The judge listened carefully. My grandmother used to ask about my work during our Sunday calls. I told her about the mobile clinics, the children we treated, the families we met. The courtroom remained quiet. Eventually, she told me something. She had always wanted to build something on that land behind the house, something useful, a community center, a place for children who needed help. I looked down briefly before continuing. She said the land had always felt wasted, sitting empty. Mr. Carter asked the next question. So you purchased the land? Yes, but I placed it in her name. Why? Because it was her dream. The judge glanced down at the documents again. The development analysis included in the purchase folder indicated something else. The parcels sit near the planned Western Highway expansion. Correct. Which means their projected development value could exceed $1.2 billion over the next decade. A low murmur moved through the courtroom. Dad stared at me. That land is worth billions. Potentially. Then why give it to her? Because she wanted to build something meaningful on it, not sell it. Silence settled over the room again. My parents' attorney tried once more. But you admit you controlled the transaction. I shook my head. No, I funded the purchase. But the decision about the land was hers. Dad spoke suddenly. You expect this court to believe you spent almost $1 million on property you did not own. I looked at him. For the first time since the hearing began, our eyes met directly. Yes, because she was my grandmother. The judge closed the folder slowly. This testimony significantly alters the context of the estate dispute. She looked toward my parents' attorney. If the property was funded by the defendant but placed in the decedent's name voluntarily, the argument of financial manipulation becomes difficult to sustain. Vanessa stared at me now with something close to disbelief. Mom looked pale. Dad still seemed to be trying to understand what he had just heard. Not the legal argument, the life behind it, the years he had not seen, the work I had done far away from Willowbrook. The judge called for another brief recess. I stepped down from the stand and returned to the table beside Mr. Carter. Across the room, Dad remained seated. He was staring at the documents in front of him. His expression had changed again. Not anger this time, something quieter, almost uncertain. And for the first time in 8 years, it seemed possible that my dad was beginning to realize how little he actually knew about the daughter he had thrown out of his house. The recess ended quicker than I expected. People filtered back into the courtroom slowly, still whispering to each other in the careful way people do when they are not supposed to be whispering. Small towns thrive on unfinished stories. And today, the Mercer family story was suddenly full of holes. When the judge returned to the bench, the room settled again. Mr. Carter remained standing beside the evidence table. Your Honor, there is one additional item left by the decedent that the court should review. He lifted a thick, sealed envelope. The paper looked old but carefully preserved. The judge raised an eyebrow. What is that? A set of materials your grandmother asked me to deliver to the court only if her will was challenged. Dad leaned forward sharply. What materials? Mr. Carter did not answer him. He approached the bench and handed the envelope to the bailiff. The judge examined the seal for a moment before opening it. Inside were several items. A small flash drive, 2 audio recording discs, and a thick handwritten notebook. The judge looked toward Mr. Carter. Please explain. He nodded. Approximately 6 months before her death, your grandmother asked me to witness a series of statements regarding her estate. She said she wanted to ensure the court would understand the circumstances surrounding her final decisions. The judge motioned for him to continue. Mr. Carter plugged the flash drive into the court monitor system. A moment later, the courtroom screen flickered to life. The image appeared slowly. Grandma sat in her living room chair by the window, the same chair where I had pictured her waiting for our Sunday calls. She looked older than I remembered, her hair thinner, her shoulders slightly bent, but her eyes were still sharp. She looked directly into the camera. If you are watching this video, it means my family is arguing about my estate. Her voice was quiet but steady. I want the court to understand something clearly. She paused. During the final years of my life, I was alone most of the time. Mom shifted in her seat. Vanessa looked down at the table. Grandma continued speaking. My son and his family rarely visited, holidays sometimes, but very few other days. She took a slow breath. The only person who called me every week was my granddaughter Lillian. The courtroom felt very still. Every Sunday evening she called me from wherever she was working. We spoke about her patients and the children she helped. Sometimes she sent money when the taxes became difficult. She never asked for anything in return. I heard someone shift quietly in the gallery behind me. Grandma looked down briefly before continuing. My granddaughter Vanessa did visit sometimes, but most of our conversations were about money. Mom stiffened. Vanessa whispered something to her attorney. But the video continued. I want the court to know that my decisions about my will were not influenced by anyone. They were my own. She leaned slightly closer to the camera. Lillian did not know about the will, and she never asked for my house or land. The screen went dark. For several seconds, nobody moved. The judge turned toward Mr. Carter. Is there additional evidence? Yes. He picked up one of the discs. This recording was captured on your grandmother's personal recorder approximately 4 months before her passing. The bailiff placed the disc into the audio system. The speakers crackled briefly. Then voices filled the courtroom. Grandma's voice first. Vanessa, I cannot give you any more money this month. Vanessa's voice followed immediately, louder than I expected. You have plenty. I heard the rustle of furniture. Grandma sounded tired. That money is for my care. Vanessa laughed. Your care. You sit in that chair all day. Then her voice turned sharper. Darren needs help with his business. The silence in the courtroom deepened. Grandma spoke again. I already helped last month. Vanessa snapped back. You are selfish. Grandma did not respond for a moment. Then she said quietly, that money belongs to me. Vanessa's voice exploded. You would be nothing without this family. There was a loud clatter like something being knocked over. Then the recording ended. Mom covered her mouth. Vanessa's face had turned pale. The judge looked down at the transcript Mr. Carter handed her. Do you have anything further? Mr. Carter lifted the thick notebook. Your grandmother kept a journal. The pages are dated. He opened it carefully. Entries spanning several years. He read one aloud. Sunday evening, 7 o'clock. Lillian called from Cleveland again. She sounds tired, but she still laughs. I wish my son would call like that. Another page. January. Lillian sent money for the property tax. She told me not to worry about it. I worry anyway. Another page. Vanessa visited today. She asked for more money. I told her no. She was angry. The courtroom remained silent except for the sound of turning pages. Mr. Carter closed the notebook. These entries continue for several years, each one documenting weekly conversations with Lillian and increasingly rare visits from other family members. The judge leaned back slightly. She looked toward my parents' table. Do you dispute the authenticity of these materials? Their attorney spoke carefully. We would need time to review them. Of course. The judge then turned back toward Mr. Carter. You also mentioned the residence itself. Yes, Your Honor. He handed over another set of documents. Property records confirming that the Maple Ridge residence remained in the decedent's name until her death. Which means, the judge finished the sentence quietly. It became part of the estate. Mr. Carter nodded, and therefore belongs to the designated heir. The judge looked across the room. The court accepts these materials into evidence. The gavel tapped once against the bench. The sound echoed softly across the room. I looked toward my parents. Dad stared at the table. Mom looked shaken. Vanessa avoided everyone's eyes. And for the first time since this case began, the truth was no longer something whispered in private. It had been spoken aloud in a courtroom where everyone could hear it. The silence after the judge accepted the evidence felt different from the earlier quiet. This one carried weight, not suspense, reality. The judge looked down at the files on her desk for several moments before speaking again. Counsel, if the parties are prepared, we will continue. My parents' attorney stood slowly. He looked less confident than he had that morning, but people who build cases around reputation rarely abandon them easily. Your Honor, the family still believes the defendant manipulated the decedent emotionally and financially during the years she lived away from Willowbrook. He turned slightly toward me. In fact, we would like to better understand the defendant's circumstances during those years. The judge nodded. Proceed. He walked a few steps toward the witness stand. Miss Mercer, where exactly did you go after leaving Willowbrook? I remained seated for a moment, then stood and returned to the stand. Cleveland first. I worked with a nonprofit medical outreach group. Doing what? Mobile clinics. Mostly dental and basic medical care. The attorney raised an eyebrow. Volunteer work. Not entirely. I was paid enough to live modestly, and you did that for 8 years. I shook my head. Not exactly. He waited. Then what changed? I looked briefly toward the courtroom window. Sunlight had shifted across the floor. In the reflection of the glass, I could see my parents sitting behind me, watching. In 2020, I started a company. The attorney glanced toward his notes. What kind of company? Silverhaven Living. The name seemed to move through the room quietly. Several people in the gallery exchanged looks. The attorney frowned slightly. What does that company do? We build and operate residential care communities for elderly people. He tilted his head. Nursing homes. I shook my head gently. Not exactly. Residential care communities. The difference matters. The judge leaned forward slightly. Explain. Most nursing homes focus only on medical care. Our facilities are designed for long-term living, private apartments, community spaces, medical care integrated with daily life. The attorney crossed his arms. And this company began in 2020. Yes. He glanced toward my parents. How large could such a company possibly be after only a few years? Mr. Carter stood before I answered. Your Honor, if the court permits, we have documentation prepared regarding the company. The judge gestured toward him. Proceed. He placed several folders on the evidence table. Silverhaven Living was incorporated in the spring of 2020. He handed the first document to the judge. The company opened its first residential facility in Cleveland in late 2021. He continued calmly. As of today, the company operates 25 residential communities across 4 states: Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Illinois. The quiet in the courtroom returned again. My parents' attorney looked toward the documents. 25. Yes. The facilities provide assisted living and long-term care services. Many residents are elderly individuals without strong family support. The judge studied the file carefully. This company was founded by the defendant. Yes, she remains the majority owner. The attorney shifted his stance. And this business came from your humanitarian work. Yes. When you spend years visiting elderly patients in underfunded care homes, you start to see the same problems everywhere. Understaffed facilities, lonely residents, families who visit once a year, or never. I paused briefly. Grandma used to ask about those stories during our phone calls. The judge watched me closely. What made you decide to start the company? One night, after visiting a facility outside Cleveland, I realized something. If people were willing to spend money on luxury retirement communities, then maybe that money could fund better care for people who had nowhere else to go. The attorney scoffed softly. You expect this court to believe your humanitarian mission turned into a company with 25 locations in just a few years. Mr. Carter opened another folder. The company grew quickly because investors recognized the model. Silverhaven Communities combine medical care with residential design. They operate at high occupancy and reinvest profits into expanding services. He handed another document forward. Independent audits confirm the company currently operates 25 facilities with expansion projects underway. Dad shifted in his seat. I could hear the faint movement of his chair even from the witness stand. The attorney looked toward the judge again. Your Honor, regardless of business success, the family maintains that the defendant abandoned her grandmother for years. The judge raised one finger. Counsel. That claim has already been challenged by the video testimony and financial records presented earlier. The attorney hesitated, then he tried another approach. Miss Mercer, if your company is as successful as described, why return to claim an inheritance? The question hung in the air. I answered quietly. Because it was never about the money. He waited for more. I continued. My grandmother believed that land could help children who had nothing, the 2 parcels behind the house. She wanted to build a community center, medical services, education programs, a place for children who had been forgotten. I looked down briefly at my hands. When she told me that idea, I promised her something. The attorney leaned closer. What promise? That if she left the land to me, I would build what she dreamed about. The judge watched silently. Dad suddenly spoke from across the room. You expect us to believe all of this? The judge tapped the bench lightly. Mr. Mercer, you will remain silent unless called to testify. Dad sat back slowly, but he kept staring at me, not with anger. Something else. Something I had not seen in his face in many years. Confusion. The attorney returned to his table. Mr. Carter closed the last folder. Your Honor, we have one additional document. The judge nodded. Employee records for Silverhaven Living. She flipped through the pages slowly. Then she looked up. Miss Mercer. Yes. Her expression remained neutral but curious. How many employees currently work for your company? I looked down briefly at the paper Mr. Carter had placed in front of me earlier that morning. Then I looked back up, across all locations. A little over 1,000 employees. The number moved through the courtroom slowly, not loudly, just enough to shift the air. My parents' attorney blinked once as if he had not expected an answer that large. The judge wrote something down on the paper in front of her. 1,000 employees. Yes, medical staff, care specialists, administrators, maintenance, kitchen staff, community coordinators, people who take care of the residents every day. The judge nodded slowly. Thank you. I stepped down from the stand and returned to the table beside Mr. Carter. Across the room, my dad was still watching me. But the look in his eyes had changed again. He no longer looked angry. He looked like someone trying to solve a puzzle that had too many missing pieces. The judge was about to move the proceedings forward when the courtroom doors opened quietly. Everyone turned toward the back. A woman stepped inside wearing a navy coat and carrying a leather folder. She spoke briefly with the bailiff before approaching the center aisle. Mr. Carter leaned slightly toward me, right on time. The judge looked toward the newcomer. Please identify yourself for the record. The woman walked to the witness stand with steady steps. My name is Rachel Whitmore. I am the mayor of Willowbrook. A ripple of surprise moved across the room. Several people in the gallery leaned forward. Even my parents' attorney looked momentarily unsure. The judge studied the witness list in front of her. Mayor Whitmore, you have been called as a witness by the defense. Yes. Mr. Carter stood. Your Honor, Mayor Whitmore has relevant information regarding the defendant's professional activities and their impact on the community. The judge gestured for him to continue. Mr. Carter approached the witness stand. Mayor Whitmore, are you familiar with the company Silverhaven Living? Yes, very familiar. How so? She opened the folder she had brought. Silverhaven Living operates several residential care communities in our region. Their facilities provide long-term housing and medical support for elderly residents. Mr. Carter nodded. Do you know how many people from Willowbrook currently work for this company? She glanced down at the document. More than 300 employees. The number landed differently than the earlier one. 1,000 employees across the company was impressive, but 300 from this town meant something personal. A quiet stir moved through the benches behind me. I heard someone whisper a name. Another voice murmured something about a sister who worked at one of the facilities. Mayor Whitmore continued speaking. Many of those employees live right here in Willowbrook. Several families in this town rely on those jobs. My parents' attorney stood abruptly. Your Honor, I fail to see how this is relevant to the estate dispute. The judge raised a hand. Let the witness finish. Mayor Whitmore nodded. Silverhaven Living recently submitted a proposal to open a new residential facility just outside Willowbrook. The room grew even quieter. A new facility. In this town. Mr. Carter asked the next question calmly. How large would that facility be? The preliminary plan includes 100 residential units, full medical staff, community services, rehabilitation programs. She paused briefly. The project would create approximately 150 new jobs. I heard several people behind me shift in their seats. A job announcement spreads through a small town faster than any rumor. Mayor Whitmore continued. The planning board has already begun reviewing the proposal. The judge leaned forward slightly. And the defendant is the owner of the company proposing this development, yes. My parents' attorney looked as though he had swallowed something sour. He attempted one final objection. Your Honor, again this seems unrelated to the will. The judge folded her hands. On the contrary, the testimony helps establish the defendant's credibility and financial independence, which directly challenges the claim that she manipulated the decedent for financial gain. The attorney sat down slowly. Across the room, Dad rubbed one hand across his forehead. Mom looked stunned. Vanessa sat motionless. Mayor Whitmore continued speaking calmly. I would also like to clarify something for the court. Several families in Willowbrook have relatives currently living in Silver Haven facilities. She glanced briefly toward the gallery. I have personally visited two of those locations. The quality of care is exceptional. The judge nodded slightly. Thank you, Mayor Whitmore. She turned a page on the file in front of her. Before stepping down, the mayor added one more sentence. For the record, the proposed Willowbrook facility would likely become one of the largest employers in this region. Another quiet murmur moved through the courtroom. People were no longer whispering about rumors. They were doing quick mental calculations. Jobs, families, future growth. Mayor Whitmore stepped down from the stand and left the witness area. As she passed the gallery, several people nodded respectfully to her. When she exited the courtroom, the silence returned once again. But it was no longer the same silence that had filled the room earlier in the day. Something fundamental had shifted. The Mercer name had carried weight in Willowbrook for decades. My dad's dental practice, Mom's charity committees, Vanessa's reputation as the town's hardworking nurse. But reputations built on stories can collapse quickly when the truth arrives. And today the truth had arrived in layers. Bank records, audio recordings, grandma's video. And now the mayor of the town explaining what my work had actually become. The judge closed the final folder on her desk. She looked across the courtroom slowly. This hearing has presented extensive testimony and documentary evidence. She paused. Given the complexity of the case, the court will review the material overnight before issuing a final ruling. My parents' attorney stood. Your Honor, the judge continued speaking before he could finish. The court will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock. She lifted the gavel. The final decision regarding the estate of Lillian Mercer will be delivered at that time. The gavel struck once. The sound echoed softly through the courtroom. People began standing slowly. Papers shuffled. Chairs moved. But no one spoke loudly. Everyone in that room understood something important had happened that day. I remained seated for a moment beside Mr. Carter. Across the room, my dad was still staring at the files on the table in front of him. For the first time since I returned to Willowbrook, he did not look at me like I was an enemy. He looked like a man who had just discovered that the story he told the world about his daughter had been wrong all along. And tomorrow the court would decide the rest. I barely slept that night. The hotel room in Willowbrook was quiet in the way small-town nights always are. No traffic, no distant city noise, just the faint sound of wind moving through the trees outside the window. 8 years earlier, I had left this town believing I might never come back. Now I was lying in a narrow hotel bed waiting for a judge to decide the future of everything my grandmother had built. But the strange thing was that I did not feel afraid. I felt tired. Not the kind of tired that comes from travel or lack of sleep. The kind that settles into your bones after carrying the same story for years. A story other people wrote about you. And tomorrow that story was finally ending. Morning came quickly. The courtroom was already half full when I arrived. Word travels fast in Willowbrook. People who had never attended a court hearing in their lives suddenly found reasons to sit in those wooden benches. The judge entered exactly at 9 o'clock. Everyone stood. Then the room settled into a silence so complete it felt almost physical. The judge opened the file in front of her and began speaking. After reviewing the testimony and evidence presented during the previous hearings, the court finds that the last will and testament of the decedent remains valid and enforceable. My parents' attorney lowered his head slightly. The judge continued. The property known as the Maple Ridge residence, along with the associated land parcels described in the estate documents, shall transfer to the designated heir. She looked directly toward me. Lillian Mercer. For a moment, the room felt suspended in place. Then she continued reading. The estimated value of the Maple Ridge residence is approximately $2.5 million. The two adjacent land parcels remain under the control of the heir and are not subject to the challenge brought by the plaintiffs. My grandmother's house. The land she had dreamed about. The judge turned another page. Additionally, the court orders that the financial records presented regarding withdrawals from the decedent's assistance accounts be forwarded for further investigation. She looked toward Vanessa, specifically regarding potential misappropriation of funds. Vanessa went completely still. Mom gripped her arm. Dad stared straight ahead. The judge closed the file. This court recognizes the validity of the decedent's expressed intentions and finds no evidence that the heir manipulated or exploited the decedent in any manner. The gavel struck once. The sound was softer than I expected, but it carried all the finality it needed. The courtroom slowly came back to life. People stood. Whispers moved through the benches. A few reporters near the back began packing their notebooks. I remained seated for several seconds. Mr. Carter leaned toward me. "It is finished." I nodded. "Finished." The word felt strange. Across the room, my parents were standing. Dad spoke quietly with their attorney. Vanessa looked shaken. Mom looked like she had not yet decided whether to be angry or embarrassed. Eventually, they began walking toward me. I could see the moment Dad decided what he was going to say. His shoulders straightened slightly. His voice softened. "Lillian." I stood slowly. He stopped a few feet away. For the first time in years, he looked at me the way fathers usually look at their daughters, with something that resembled regret. "We should talk." Mom nodded quickly. "Yes. This has gone too far. Families argue, but we can still fix things." Vanessa stood a little behind them, silent. I listened without interrupting. Dad continued. "We were angry when you left, but 8 years is a long time. People change. We can move forward." His eyes drifted briefly toward the courthouse windows, toward the world outside, toward the future he was probably imagining. The land, the development potential, the company, all the things he had learned about in the last 2 days. Mom stepped closer. "You do not have to shut us out forever. We are still your family." For a moment, I said nothing. Then I looked at both of them. "You told the whole town I was not your daughter anymore." Dad inhaled slowly. "That was a mistake. Maybe. But it was not just words. For 8 years, you told everyone I was useless. You told them I stole money and ran away with some terrible boyfriend. You erased me from your family." Mom looked down at the floor. Dad opened his mouth again, but no words came out. I continued quietly. "Now the court says the house belongs to me. The land belongs to me. And suddenly you want to talk." He shook his head quickly. "That is not what this is about." But we both knew that was not entirely true. The problem with silence is that it leaves room for honesty. And honesty had already filled that courtroom yesterday. I took a slow breath. Grandma believed that land could become something better than an argument. She wanted a place where children who had no families could still find safety, education, medical care, community. I am going to build that. Dad nodded slowly as if he already understood. Mom tried once more. "Maybe we can help." I shook my head gently. "No." For the first time in years, the answer felt simple. "I hope you both find peace with what happened. But I will not pretend the past did not exist." They stood there quietly. The conversation had ended. I walked past them toward the courthouse doors. Outside, the sunlight was bright and warm. Construction permits had already been submitted for the first phase of the project. Architects were reviewing the land plans. Engineers had surveyed the property. Grandma's dream was no longer just a conversation on a Sunday phone call. It was becoming real. 3 months later, the first trucks arrived at the site behind the old house. The empty fields began to change. Foundations were marked. Survey flags moved in the wind. Workers laughed and talked while unloading equipment. The future always begins with ordinary sounds like that. Hammers, voices, engines. Sometimes I stand on the edge of the property and watch the construction. Not because I am thinking about the court case, or my parents, or everything that happened in that courtroom. I stand there because I remember the last promise I made to my grandmother, and because promises should mean something. Sometimes people ask me if I regret coming back to Willowbrook, facing my family, standing in that courtroom where everyone believed their version of the story. The truth is that I do not regret it, because silence can protect you for a while. But eventually, the truth deserves a place to stand. If you have ever been told you were too much or not enough for your own family, remember this. Silence can be power, and truth can be the loudest revenge. Tell me in the comments what integrity means to you and where you are listening from.